Hello everybody, my name is Cubits, and welcome to how to make Skyrim Special Edition combat more realistic. If you're watching this video, you, like me, are probably a little bit frustrated with the way that vanilla combat is handled. Although I had plenty of fun when Skyrim first came out, after years of using mods, it just doesn't cut it anymore. And when I tried Skyrim Special Edition out for the first time, the simplistic combat system was the first thing that I noticed. So if you don't want enemies to be spongy, but you still want a challenge, if you're irritated with the fact that steel weapons are essentially plastic bats, if you want an overall more realistic combat system, then look no further, this video is going to have the mods for you. Keep in mind while you're watching this that actually all of the mods work well together. That means you can feel free to mix and match each and one of these mods, or use them all at the same time. Also keep in mind that a good number of these are available for consoles as well. So without further ado, let's get into the biggest combat overhaul included in this mod compilation. Wildcat is a combat overhaul designed to make combat a lot more dynamic, include a few elements of realism, and tweak the damage scaling. If you know anything about the way Bethesda treats difficulty, then you know that the only thing they do to make things more or less difficult is scaling the amount of damage you do and the amount of damage enemies do. This system is artificial difficulty, and it's hardly realistic when you're in a confrontation with a bandit. On Legendary, it shouldn't be necessary to hit them 5 times over to actually do any significant damage. Wildcat tweaks the difficulty scaling, and the setting that I recommend most for you is the Legendary setting. This is because 4 times damage is dealt towards you, and 4 times damage is dealt toward enemy NPCs. This means that swords are going to behave a lot more like swords, and yet at the same time, you're going to have a thrilling and challenging experience. Another element that Wildcat adds is something called injuries and staggering, meaning that if you go below a certain amount of health, it becomes significantly easier for NPCs to stagger you. This of course is also true for those NPCs as well. In other words, it goes both ways. Injuries are similar in that they affect you when you get to a low enough health percentage, and they also affect NPCs. For example, if you're low on health and get hit in the chest by an NPC, then your stamina will stop regenerating and begin to deplete itself. Another example is if you hit an NPC in the arm and they're at low health, there's actually a chance to disarm them. Essentially, Wildcat takes into consideration that you probably won't be able to fight your very best if you're very wounded. It also makes combat scenarios less repetitive, meaning different situations could happen at different times. Another element that this mod adds is that NPCs work a lot better together. They will take advantage of the fact that you're at low health and try to overwhelm you. There are other elements of this mod, including timed blocking, several combat modifiers, and some tweaks to movement. Overall, it hopes to make combat less repetitive and also a lot more realistic. In my opinion, Wildcat is a great mod to start building off of if you're looking to overhaul the combat in your game. Another really terrific combat mod is called Combat Evolved. This mod is very similar to Wildcat, except it focuses primarily on AI. With Combat Evolved, enemies are much more aggressive and intelligent. Ultimately, it means that you really need to move around, be aware of your surroundings, and not be too foolhardy. Enemies will really use all the tools at their disposal. They will block more often and dodge attacks more frequently. This mod certainly does increase the difficulty of your game, but it definitely does not make any encounter insurmountable. It aims to give you a more thrilling experience and works very well in conjunction with Wildcat. Before we move on to another bigger mod, I want to recommend to you Sturdy Dragons. If you choose to use the damage modifier in Wildcat, I strongly recommend that you use Sturdy Dragons, and specifically the hardcore version. The reason being is although it definitely does make for more realistic combat when you're fighting things like bandits, wolves, bears, etc., the damage modifier just makes dragons a little bit too squishy, and so I recommend that you use this mod if you're using the Wildcat damage modifier. Next up, we have a mod called Mortal Enemies. Mortal Enemies is a little bit of a personal taste mod. I definitely enjoy using it, but it certainly does change some of the game mechanics. In vanilla Skyrim, you can change your direction as much as you'd like mid-swing. In fact, you can do an entire 180 while doing a power attack with a two-handed weapon. Although it makes for smooth movement, it's definitely far from realistic. With mortal enemies, you have to be much more precise in where you aim. However, it doesn't just affect you, it also affects enemy NPCs. Vanilla enemies have an extremely fast turn rate. That basically means that they're guaranteed to hit you if they're within a certain amount of distance. That's just a little bit silly. With mortal enemies installed, it's much more important that you're aware of the direction that people are facing, and it's important to keep moving while in combat. The reduced turn rate is modified depending on the type of weapon that you're using. The smaller the weapon, the faster you can turn, and if you're doing a power attack with a two-handed weapon, then it's very difficult for you and NPCs to redirect it. Another thing this mod does is modify the damage cones. Damage cones are the area in which you will get hit by an attack. The mod author thought that they were a little bit too similar regardless of what enemy you are facing. I certainly agree with that. So as an example, Draugr stabs will be much more narrow, bears have a big reach but are much more slow. Ultimately, this mod makes hitboxes a lot more dynamic, a lot more realistic. It means that moving around will actually do something if you are in a fight. The change in mechanics might not be for everyone, but in my opinion, it definitely makes a big impact in making the combat seem a lot more realistic. The next mod that I have for you is called Realistic Melee Range. This is an extremely simple tweak. All it does is it reduces the range of melee weapons a little bit for both you and the enemies. Melee weapons in Skyrim actually have more of a reach than is shown in their animation. Swords will touch NPCs without actually touching them. It makes it pretty much impossible to backstep away from an attack. Realistic Melee Range fixes this. It's a very minor tweak, but overall it makes the animations line up a lot more with the hitboxes. Another minor tweak is called No BS Projectile Dodge. Here's a little issue that Vanilla Skyrim has. You may or may not have noticed it. Sometimes when you pull back an arrow and an NPC isn't even facing you, when you fire it, they'll actually sidestep to dodge. Now that is utter nonsense. This mod doesn't get rid of NPCs' ability to dodge your arrows, but it doesn't give them spidey senses. If you fire an arrow and you're far away from a target, and they're not even looking at you, then you should be able to hit them. This doesn't necessarily make the game all that much easier. It's a very specific tweak, but you've probably had a moment if you've played an archer character before, where you've seen an NPC with its back turned to you, sidestep as the arrow comes right next to their head. It's pretty annoying, and I definitely recommend installing this mod to fix that. The next mod that I have for you is called Animal Tweaks. This mod achieves making animals tougher, more intelligent, and more realistic in their movement. It makes it so that certain animals have certain advantages and disadvantages. Big, fearsome animals like saber cats and trolls are a lot more deadly. Large creatures have the ability to knock down opponents, but a lot of the animals are a lot less aggressive than they were before. Some are more aggressive, some are less aggressive. Generally, it makes animals behave a lot more realistically, depending on their species, and makes big bad ones a lot more dangerous to fight. Now let's move into a sneak-oriented mod. Realistic AI Detection overhauls the detection system and makes it have a lot more variables. Enemies have a better ability of seeing and hearing, however, it really depends on a variety of different things. For instance, the visual detection of NPCs, if there aren't any light sources around, is very low. And if you're not wearing heavy armor, you succeed at sneaking much more. Enemies will search for you longer, about 30 seconds instead of 10 seconds. Sleeping enemies have their hearing reduced. Overall, it just makes a bunch of immersive tweaks to detection, makes it slightly harder in some ways and slightly easier in some ways. The system is a lot more dynamic, and there are different things you can do to improve your chances. All in all, it's a lot more realistic. Here's another very small mod. Lethal Traps is a mod designed to make the traps in dungeons a lot more scary. Just about all of the ones offered in dungeons are pretty freaking brutal. They're big walls with spikes, axes swinging back and forth, stuff that most people probably wouldn't be able to survive. So why is it that your character does? Why is it that any character does? What this mod accomplishes is it makes all of the traps more lethal, do a lot more damage, not only to you, but also to NPCs and enemies. No more will you get hit by 1,000 poison needles, a swinging axe, or a revolving spike door and just walk it off. For the next mod, you're going to have to humor me a little bit. Ordinator doesn't have a lot to do with realism, but if you're interested in spicing up your combat experience, I definitely recommend it. What it does is it overhauls the perk system. It adds a bunch of new perks, it makes the perk progression a little bit more interesting, and puts serious value into specialization. I can't really think of how to spin this in a way that is quote-unquote realistic. However, if you have a bunch of these mods installed, things that overhaul damage, AI, enemies, you'll probably appreciate something that adds a lot more to your character progression. Next up, we have a mod that you probably already have installed. It's called Run for Your Lives. If you play vanilla Skyrim and you've ever seen a dragon attack on a village, you probably noticed how insane it is that the local granny is just running in with a knife, ready to take on the dragon head on. That is probably not realistic. I'm sure there are some 80-year-olds that probably wouldn't mind getting into a knife fight with a dragon, but I'm just assuming that most civilians probably wouldn't like that very much. This makes characters that aren't a warrior class or guards run in terror when a dragon is attacking a village or a town. The NPCs will run inside and cower there until you kill the dragon or the dragon just leaves. It makes dragon attacks a lot more immersive, and it might spare a couple of those non-essential NPCs. Another tiny tweak that you might have installed already is called Realistic Ragdolls and Force. It makes the knockbacks from combat a lot less exaggerated. So if you get stabbed in the chest, you're probably not going to go flying 10 feet. This is another one of those personal preference things, but if you thought that the death animations were a little bit too ridiculous, both for yourself and for NPCs, then I recommend giving this an install. Next up, we have a mod called Practice Dummies. This is a very particular mod that is mostly there just to increase your immersion. It's a little bit odd that the only way that you can get better at your combat skills is by getting into an actual confrontation. Realistically, there should be a lot more ways you can improve it besides just getting lessons. Practice Dummies adds a tiny little XP gain whenever you attack any of the dummies scattered around the world of Skyrim. In addition, it also gives you a tiny XP boost when you shoot arrows at targets. I definitely don't recommend this as a way to level up. It doesn't gain your skills as fast as being in an actual battle, but if you're really close to leveling up, you don't have much gold, why can't you just practice for a minute or two? Although I don't use this mod all too much, I still think that it adds a lot to making the world just a little bit more realistic. Next, we have two mods that focus primarily on weapon design. First, we have Lean Wolf's Better Shaped Weapons. Vanilla weapons are designed very ridiculously. They look like big metal paddles. Some people might like that design, however, they definitely don't look like real swords. If you'd like them to be a little bit more slender and a little bit more sharp, then I recommend giving this an install. It's a very simple change, but it definitely does make combat look a lot more realistic. And we also have Real Bows. This mod accomplishes something very similar. The vanilla bows don't really look like real bows. They look a little bit like Nerf bows. Something that's a little bit cartoonish, and again, some people might like that, but if you'd prefer all of the different bows in the game to be overhauled to look like actual bows, although with their own little design attributes, I recommend trying this one out. Last but not least, we have a very small design mod. It's called Visible Favorited Gear. What this mod does is if you have a weapon favorited, it'll appear on your back or at your side. That means when you're switching between weapons in combat, your great sword won't just disappear into thin air. Your bow will stay attached to your back. It's a very little tweak, but I think a lot of you guys will appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching. You can find links to all of these mods in the description. And if you'd like to see more videos like this one, make sure to subscribe to my channel. Hit the bell if you want to super subscribe. And if you're looking for more mod recommendations, you can check out my best Skyrim mods of all time video, where I highlight all of my favorite Skyrim mods. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video.